Okay, and welcome back, students who are taking financial accounting. We're working on the Chapter 2 exercises, Group B. And so this is like the third video in this series. And I'm just going to pick up with 2-25. If I'm just going to jump right into it here. But if you had watched exercise 2-24B, then you see why I'm just going to jump into into number 25 here. But if you didn't watch 24, watch at least the first 4 or 5 minutes of that video, which gives you some explanation as to why I'm just jumping into 25 without explaining a lot of stuff. So I'm just going to pick right up where I left off here. And because like I said, this chapter is going to be about making a lot of journal entries. All right. It says completed the following transactions in the first month of operations using the steps outlined in the 5-step transaction process, which I am not going to do. See the 2-24B for why I'm not doing that. Journalize the transactions and explanations are not required. Okay, so my pen here. All right, December 1st. Sold $80,000 of common stock to start the business. Okay, so I'm asking myself, am I affecting cash? And that's yes, because why? The business is getting $80,000. So this was the balance, and it increases. My cash balance increases by 80. So that means I'm going to debit my cash for 80,000, and that means I credit something else. And in this case here, it's common stock for 80,000. Okay, and that's it for that journal entry. Pay attention to the formatting. Get used to doing the formatting. Okay, get used to making the entries like that all the time, regardless of the lines on the paper. I don't want to see final exam journal entries that are written out in paragraph format. You lose points. I mean, because if you write this is a debit to this account for that amount, and then that's not how journal entries are created. You don't see that kind of journal entry in paragraph English written format in a book. No, you follow the formats that are supplied in the book or as I'm doing them. So get used to doing them in this fashion, and that's the way they should be presented, whether it's in a journal or whether you're typing them out on blank copy paper for a test. Okay. Next, 12.3, purchased supplies on account. Okay, so for 160. So am I affecting cash? Okay, no, I'm not affecting cash because I'm buying supplies on account. On account being either on credit, and since I'm purchasing, I know that's an accounts payable. So the answer to question 1 is, am I affecting cash? No. Okay, then I ask, cash? Then I ask, am I affecting accounts receivable or accounts payable? And the answer to that is yes. So I'm buying the supplies on account. So if this was the balance in my payable account and I'm increasing it by $160, that means I'm going to end up crediting accounts payable for $160. I have to debit something else, and that debit, what am I buying? I'm buying supplies. So I'm going to debit supplies for $160, and that's that entry. Okay. Pause the video and write those down if you have to. Okay. Rewind and play them again if you need to. 12.5. Paid cash for building to use for storage, 45,000. So am I affecting cash? Yes, because I'm paying it out. This was my balance, and I'm paying out 45,000. So my cash is decreasing by 45,000. So I'm going to credit cash for 45,000. And that means I debit something else. What am I debiting? Well, I'm paying cash for a building. I don't care what the usage is. That's useless information. Okay, I'm paying cash for a building, so I'm going to debit building for 45,000. That's my entry. next one, 12.6. Performed service for customers and received cash for $3,700. So am I affecting cash? Yes. Why? I'm receiving cash. How much am I receiving? Well, my cash is increasing by $3,700. So if cash increases, that means I'm going to debit cash for $3,700 and I credit something else. Well, what am I doing here? I'm performing service. Okay, so that's the normal operation of my business. So I look under my sales accounts and I see service revenue, maybe. Okay, let's see. Yep, that's what they put in the answer, service revenue, and that's a credit for $3,700. It could have been sales revenue or could have just been called sales, when you're performing the service. Okay, right now we're going to call it service revenue, but what you would do is make sure you look at your chart of accounts and choose the most appropriate account. Okay, all bookkeepers and accountants have a chart of accounts posted right there on the wall for the easy access for them to look at in order to select the right accounts when they're in the workplace. Okay, so that's 12.11 now. Paid on accounts payable, $120. Again, you saw this in the previous problem, in the previous exercise. Don't start with the accounts payable just because you recognize the words accounts payable. Start with cash. Okay, am I affecting cash? Yes. Why? Because I'm paying it. So I'm paying out, how much was that, 120? Yep, I'm paying out $120. Okay, so I'm decreasing my cash, so I know that's a credit to cash for 120, and then I have to debit something else. Now I know to debit accounts payable for the 120. Okay, entry is done. I only had to make one decision. What was my cash, increasing or decreasing, and whether it's a debit or a credit. And that by now you should have it kind of almost memorized. It should be becoming internalized on how to treat cash. Increases debit, decreases a credit, and it makes the entry that easy. Okay, so this stuff here, if you've been doing these here problems, these journal entries all along and kind of following, this here thought process, you should be internalizing it by now and making it easier on yourself. Okay, perform service for customers on account for $26.50. So you recognize on account, right? And it's perform services, right? So you're thinking about accounts receivable because you're performing service for a customer. Customers are receivables. Vendors are payables. But you don't ask yourself, you don't work with the accounts receivable first. You ask, am I affecting cash? Okay, and the answer to that is no. All right, I am not affecting cash. Right. Then I ask, am I affecting receivables or payables? And the answer to that is yes. Now you work with the receivable, and you treat the receivable the same exact way that you treat cash because they're both assets. So is my receivables going up? Yes, it's going up by $26.50. So I'm going to debit accounts receivable for $26.50, and I credit something else for $26.50. Well, what am I doing? I'm performing a service, all right? So that's the normal operation of my business. So I'd look under my revenue accounts and I choose whatever account makes the most amount of sense. That's on my chart of accounts. In this case, I'm happening to use service revenue, and that's the journal entry for that one. Uh, 12-24. Received cash from a customer on account for $2,100. So am I affecting cash? Yes. Is my cash increasing? Yes, it's increasing to $2,100. So that means I'm going to debit cash because I'm receiving it for $2,100, and I credit something else. Well, what am I going to credit for $2,100? I'm receiving cash from a customer on account. Well, if it's a customer on account, that means it's a receivable. So I'm going to credit accounts receivable for $2,100. And I don't have to think about whether I'm debiting or crediting my receivable. It automatically works. That's why deal with cash first, then deal with your receivable or payable second, even if you are using those, 2 out of those 3 accounts. Okay. And lastly, 1231, paid the following expenses: salaries and rent. Okay. Now this is going to be a multi-line journal entry. So far we've always been making, 2 line items, okay, for our journal entries. This is going to be multi-line. Why? We have to manipulate the data here. Okay, remember, transactions are like word problems. I have information that's directly related, information that has nothing to do, and information that has to be manipulated. Well, in this case here, we're going to have to do some manipulation. Why? Because we're paying cash, we're paying the following expenses. So, am I affecting cash? The answer is yes. All right. Is my cash increase or decreasing? Well, it's decreasing because I'm paying it, right? But how much is the amount? Well, I'm paying $1,100 for salaries, and I'm paying $1,450 for rent. So the total of those two means I'm paying out $2,550. So I'm decreasing my cash, so I credit cash by $2,550. Now, notice that I'm paying for 2 different things. I'm paying for salaries, which is one expense, and rent, which is another expense. So that means I'm going to have to debit the 2 accounts, not just one debit. Okay, I'm going to debit the salary expense for its amount of $1,100, and then I'm going to debit my rent expense for its amount of $1,450. Okay, and notice that the sum of these two, which is what we did in the math here, so my debits here equal my credits here, okay, because the sum of those two is that amount there. So what I've done is I've created a 3-line entry here, okay, instead of a 2-line entry. Now, I'm going to, by the way, it's, I'm at 12.5 minutes in this video, and notice that, this is 15 to 20, and I am explaining some stuff. But now I'm going to take this last one just one step further here, okay? Because this is the entry that should be made, all right? However, and I'm going to use, I'm going to do it, just follow along here, okay? What I could do is I'm saying I'm paying the following expenses: salaries and rent, okay? Well, let's say I'm paying each one separately, okay? Well, I know that I'm going to credit cash for the salaries of $1,100, and I'm debiting salary expense for $1,100, okay? And then notice over here, I'm going to credit cash for $1,450, and I'm debiting rent for $1,450, all right? I could have made 2 separate entries, 2 separate journal entries. I paid one for salaries, and then I paid the second for the rent. Okay, and I could have made 2 separate journal entries, and that would be acceptable. Okay, it would be right. Technically, it would be right. Okay, but it's inefficient. Okay, notice that you have 4 line items here. Okay, and notice I only have 3 line items here. Okay. What does that mean? Well, what that means is that now it's, when I go to post my entries, well, one, I actually had to write 1 extra line because I'm writing cash twice. Okay, so I wasted a little bit of time writing cash twice. And then when I go to post, I'm going to spend a little bit extra time because now I have to post 4 items: 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, that's 1, 2. I'm going to have to post 4 lines instead of only 3. 1, 2, 3. So I have to post one extra line item. And you can think to yourself, oh, well, that's not going to take that long. And, it's only going to be a few seconds, and that's fine. And yeah, you're right. It's only a few extra seconds. But also consider that you're trying to be efficient and you need to be accurate. And the more work that you have to do, the more possibility that you're going to be, you're going to make a mistake and be inaccurate. And if you're wrong, then, you're spending a lot more time trying to correct your mistake in your books. So, even though you have, you can do it with two separate entries, okay, it's actually better to just do one journal entry like we're doing here. Now, I wrote out these here accounts like this, okay? And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to show what the use of a T account is for, okay? Because if you're looking at this entry here, all right, and I'm doing this in green, okay? It says paid the following expenses, salaries and rent. So now if I want to know how to make this entry, and you saw me make this entry originally, but if you didn't see and you're not so sure of yourself as to be able to make 3 entries instead of the 2, I'm sorry, make 1 entry instead of the 2, you can on the side create yourself T accounts. Okay. You would label this one cash because that's a general, you're going to use cash, and then you would create a T account for salaries expense, and you would create a T account for rent expense. Okay. Now, I'm going to pay the following expenses. Salaries for, $1,100. Well, I know I'm going to credit cash for $1,100, and that means I'd have to debit salary expense for $1,100. And then I'm going to pay cash for the rent expense of $1,450. And that means, so that's a credit, and that means I'm going to debit rent expense for $1,450. Okay, now you create the balances. $2,550 is the balance for my cash, and that's a credit. $1,100 is the balance for my salary expense, and that's a debit. And $1,450 is a credit for my rent expense. That's the balance in the rent expense account. So now I can make my 3-line entry here. I can credit cash for, let me erase these lines so it's not so convoluted. I can credit my cash for the $2,550. I can debit my salaries expense for the $1,100, and I can debit my rent expense for the $1,450 and make my 3-line entry. Okay, so what I've basically done here is, in the last couple of minutes, 3 minutes, is show you 3 different ways on how to do this. Okay, as you get more experienced, you're just going to work the way I did the first way around, and that was relatively simple. If you followed the process of starting out with cash and you saw me do the math and determine what accounts in order to make the journal entry. If you're a little less experienced and you're not so confident in your skills, you could treat it as 2 separate journal entries, okay, which is not wrong, okay. And then you can say to yourself, well, I have 2 separate entries, but why am I making the cash twice here, okay? And then you could have had 2 entries, erased it, and combined them both to give you the 1 entry, right? And the last way would be to say, okay, this here entry is out of the norm for myself, okay? So let me create these here T accounts, okay? Let me create these T accounts and see where I land, and then create the journal entry from it, okay? All arrive at the same answer, all arrive at the same journal entry, okay? One is not more right than the other. One is not more wrong than the other. There is no wrong to that because they're all going to be, correct, right? But, after time and a little bit more experience, you'll progress and get to a point where you're doing it right off the cuff. Now, if this was a really complicated journal entry, even as an accountant with 30 years of experience, I wouldn't hesitate to create my T accounts in order to be able to figure out the transaction and to see what amounts go to what accounts. As an accountant, it happens to me 3-4 times a year. Okay, It's another, all it is just a tool. So don't think that you can't use T accounts, okay? Because the vast majority of the time you don't use them, right? Use it as a tool, know when to pick it up and apply it, okay? So with that said, I'm done with 2-25, and I will, this last, 6 minutes or so was that insight into, working the problems that that'll help you going forward, okay? So I'll see you in the next video for the next problem.